I'm Patrick Ryan, President of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. This is our Global Dialogue Plus program where we bring you specialists and insiders talking about important topics of the day. Today we are joined by Professor Mark Katz. He is Professor of Government and Politics at George Mason University, the Schar School of Policy and Government. Professor Katz is also non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a great friend of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. You can find a number of his programs that he's done with us on our youtube.com/TNWAC channel. And you can also find his new articles. The collapse of Afghanistan could mean trouble for America's enemies on national interest. And after the fall of Kabul, there will be more Islamist revolutions. That is out today in The Hill. But we're going to talk about the first one. Professor Katz, welcome, and thanks for joining us today on Global Dialogue Plus.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here again.
And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the collapse of Afghanistan. It could mean trouble for America's enemies, and perhaps that's the only silver lining in the developments this week, that we could see China, Russia, Iran, and I would probably include Pakistan in there among those, and not necessarily an enemy of America, but certainly a torturous relationship that we've had. So why don't you take us through your analysis and share with our audience what they can find in that article. And I'll mention that both of those articles will be in our notes so people can refer to them, but I'm sure that they will appreciate you outlining what your thoughts are in that conversation.
Very good. We're happy to do so. You know, before 9/11, but after the Taliban had come to power in Afghanistan, it was mainly the neighboring countries that were under threat. That the Russians were very afraid that the Taliban will try to spread jihadism into Central Asia. And in fact, in addition to playing host to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban also played host to a group known as the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, which launched serious raids up into Central Asia, both in 1999 and in 2000, and appeared to be getting ready for another one in 2001, but we intervened and that stopped that. So the Russians were, the Russians were supporting, sort of the last non-Taliban groups opposing the Taliban. In addition, Iran, Shia Iran and Sunni jihadist Taliban didn't get along. In fact, they almost went to war in 1998 along their common border. And I don't know at this point that the Chinese were worried, but obviously the Chinese have always been worried about their Muslim population in Xinjiang, and Afghanistan has a brief border with that. So the US-led intervention in Afghanistan, it took place in 9/11, that in many respects, it took the pressure off of these neighbors. In other words, that the US had taken upon itself the burden of fighting the Taliban so that Russia, Iran, China didn't have to do so. And so long as the US was there, that was the case. But now, of course, with the US gone, will the old situation return? And saying that while they are willing to work with the Taliban, they're very concerned about the situation in Xinjiang. The Taliban, of course, have reassured them that they have no hostile intention toward China. But you can bet that if anything happens in Xinjiang, the first people that the Chinese are going to blame is the Taliban. Similarly, the Russians, they're also trying to ingratiate themselves with the Taliban. But these governments in Central Asia, especially I think Tajikistan, it's possible that they might be vulnerable. And of course, Iran has its own Sunni opposition on the borderlands. And the thing is this: the Taliban might not actually be interested in causing trouble for their neighbors, but the very fact that they have come back to power is going to energize and embolden these groups. If the Taliban could do it, why not them? And maybe they will get some kind of help. It's conceivable. So the fact that the U.S. is not there means that the Taliban problem is now passed off to the neighboring countries, and they're not going to be able to have the United States pull their chestnuts out of the fire. They're going to have to do it on their own. And of course, whenever you reach into a fire, you can get burned. And so if there is a problem, if the US couldn't resolve this problem, these smaller countries, or not necessarily smaller, but the other countries are not going to necessarily do better than the US has done.
You mentioned Xinjiang province in China, and the Taliban have been visiting with the Chinese foreign minister in recent days and weeks. Delegations have gone. Do we know what specific interests the Chinese have besides forestalling any influence from the Islamic forces? I know we've talked in the past about the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese interest in investing in rare earth extraction. So China has a couple of things at play here. One is to take advantage of the U.S. withdrawal, and also to prevent negative consequences.
Right. It's certainly, there are a lot of mineral sources apparently in Afghanistan. This wasn't really appreciated or understood before the U.S. led intervention, and it appears that the Chinese are cognizant of this, and obviously have the money with which to buy it. And it seems like if economics is the main motive, that the Taliban should enjoy a good relationship with China. In other words, don't bother them with Xinjiang and sell them things that they're willing to pay money for. And can't we all get along on that basis? And maybe they can. On the other hand, it's just not clear that the rise of the Taliban, the people who've been talking to the Chinese, are they really in control over the whole movement? Are there people who have their own agenda? And of course, there are Uyghurs in Afghanistan, some of them, I think native, some who, come there from Xinjiang at some point through some route. And they're obviously, some of them are going to want to get involved in Xinjiang. But so far, the Taliban have indicated that they're not going to do so. But of course, I think it was back in 2000, they also told the United States that they weren't playing host to Al-Qaeda. So no one's quite sure, where they stand with the Taliban, and
Sure.
we'll just have to wait and see.
Pakistan, any thoughts on what could be consequences for Pakistan with the Taliban ascension?
Well, of course, the Taliban, as you mentioned, their main external supporters have been Pakistan, which supported them when they first came to power, and then continued to give them assistance, even though cooperating with the US supposedly in the war on terror. And I think that, to tell you the truth, to the extent that Pakistan has aided the Taliban against the US forces, I think Pakistan has to be considered an adversary of the United States. This is not the activity that a friendly nation would undertake. On the other hand, I think that, in the past, there have been, from the 1950s, when under the royal government of Afghanistan, which was a Pashtun-dominated, the Taliban are also a Pashtun-dominated group, that Afghanistan laid claim to northwestern Pakistan. There was the Pashtun-inhabited areas, the border for which between Afghanistan and Pakistan was simply drawn by the British in the late 19th century, the Durand Line, in which Afghan governments in the 20th century didn't recognize. Well, Pakistan has no desire to return this territory. And I think that, whether it was in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, when there was conflict going on in Afghanistan, and that there was a party that was getting assistance from Pakistan, that party wasn't going to press the border claim. But now with with the Taliban back in power, and of course, they've inherited an awful lot of left behind American weaponry. How much does the Taliban really depend upon Pakistan anymore? Would they reassert these claims? If they do, Pakistan will have to deal with this on their own. Now, I think what Pakistan is likely to do, in other words, that I don't think that Pakistan, in other words, their commitment to the Taliban always was situational. In other words, if the Taliban are a problem for them, I shouldn't be surprised if Pakistan, supports, well, anyone else, ISIS or the different tribal leaders, or perhaps works with some of the other regional countries. That is what they're interested in is a weak and divided Pakistan, not a strong, prosperous Afghanistan that can threaten them.
Well, you've given us a lot to absorb in these days where we're seeing this upheaval in that part of the world, and certainly Afghanistan's neighbors will have to take stock of what the ascension of the Taliban in Kabul will mean to them, and the United States will have to recalibrate its foreign policy towards the region and take stock of what our adversaries in the area can come to expect from the Taliban. We've been talking with Professor Mark Katz from the George Mason University Schar School of Policy and Government, where he is a professor of government and politics. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He has written two terrific articles yesterday and today. The first of which, the collapse of Afghanistan could mean trouble for America's enemies. And after the fall of Kabul, there will be more. Will there be more Islamist revolutions? ? So take a look at both of those. The links are in our details, and we thank Professor Katz for taking time to talk with us today.
And thank you, Patrick, for having me once again.
Our pleasure. Thanks. Have a great day.